evening, good afternoon from whichever part of the globe you're tuning into. Today we'll be discussing agricultural reform and why markets fail in agriculture. I'm not alone. Today I'm joined by my wonderful colleagues, Savannah, Achievement, Molalam, Charles, Joseph, and myself, Butali. Let's set the scene. So, as it stands, agriculture in India is not a marginal sector. It employs about 42% of its workforce and supports over 600 million people, and it sits at the foundation of the country's social contract. Yet, its share of GDP has fallen at just 15%, down from 50% at its independence. The gap between employment share and economic output is not a statistic, it's a structural crisis. About 86% of Indian farmers work less than 2 hectares, too small to merchandise, too small to absorb price shocks, and too small to negotiate. Now, we've seen the Green Revolution be brought to light via Asia, and it worked tremendously. This included wheat and rice productivity gains, but in India, for some reason, at a cost. Soil degradation, water depletion, monoculture, lock in. Agriculture now consumes about 89% of India's fresh water, hijab facing a whole lot of water depletion at a very alarming rate. Now, when we look at the market failure theory in the next slide, we have to figure out why can't the market fix this on its own? Because six district market failures make unregulated agricultural markets structurally incapable of delivering fair outcomes. Questions that rise up is there a case for the government intervention? And what really are the goals for the Modi government in agricultural reform? And lastly, but not least, are farmers justified? I'll hand over to my colleague Nzuki, who will take us through. Over to you.
Thanks, B. We've seen the market failure in theory. Now let's look at the operational reality or the situation on the ground. Agricultural Produce Market Committees APMCs were established to protect farmers um, from exploitation. The law required farmers to sell exclusively through licensed mandis. The theory was price transparency and fair access, though the reality was actually institutional capture. By 2020, India had around 7,000 mandis, but distribution was geographically uneven. Many districts were served by just one or two facilities. Because farmers were legally prohibited from selling outside the system, they had no outside options, and this created the textbook conditions of monopsony. Inside these markets, licensed commission agents are hatias charged 2 to 4% of fees. Worse, there's a documented evidence of price fixing cartels, particularly in Punjab and Haryana. The system engineered to protect farmers actually became the mechanism of the exploitation. The policy failure. Then there's a minimum support price. It was supposed to act as a safety net. The government announced a floor for 23 crops, but actual procurement was constrained to rice and wheat through the Food Corporation of India. Even though the FCI procured 90 million tons, or in 2020 and 2021, the public distribution system suffered from massive leakages amounting to about nearly 40%. As you see from this diagram here, when mandi prices persistently fell below MSP, the government procurement is limited. That price floor completely loses its bite. Thus, the producer surplus is lost. The guarantee is purely now theoretical. Ultimately, we were left with a market structure that was simultaneously overregulated and totally uncompetitive. That is entrenched. That is the entrenched system Modi found and inherited, and one he sought to dismantle. Over to you, Mullah, to explain further.
Thank you, Charles. Uh, for discussing the market structure and the power dynamics. With me, we'll be looking at the Modi reforms, focusing on the goals and the design. On the on this slide 5, we'll see the 3 laws that has been enacted by the Modi's committee. So the 3 laws, all of them are targeted on targeted market failures. One, catastrophic miscalculation. The law one blocks the agricultural produce market committee monopsony, allowing the trade outside mandis, creating parallel markets, removing state taxes that made outside mandi trade uncompetitive, and contestable market theory. Even the threat of competition disciplines the monopolists. The second law is the one enabled the contract farming, which in turn puts the legal frameworks for pre-season price agreements between farmers and the buyers, reducing the income volatility through the forward contracts. The third law is deregulated storage law, which has removed the stock limits on cereals and pulses, allowing private warehouses and cold chain investment. That also eliminated the de-weighted loss from the artificial storage caps. And these 3 sensible interventions are the ones I've discussed. And yet, on the December 2021, all the 3 repealed before implementation, almost without a precedent in Indian legislative history for some reason. Why? On the next slide, number 6, we can see the political economy role in this. Because of sometimes it's because good economics can also be bad politics that we see those results as I've mentioned earlier. For instance, Kahneman and Tversky, the losses loom twice as large as gains. Farmers' attachment to the MSP was not sentiment, it was loss aversion operating exactly as the theory predicts. The money and the MSP had become an endowment effect, treated as property rights, not policy instrument, which is the minimum support price. So the government offered no credible replacement, no binding minimum supportive price guarantee, no transition support as well, and also just it was like left as a theoretical market. Olson's collective action logic explains the rest of the things. Punjab and Haryana farmers, 5% of Indians farmers, the biggest minimum support price beneficiaries, were organized then, concentrated, and motivated. A billion diffuse consumers were not in that. And the process, as we've seen, mattered. 3 laws passed by ordinance, bypassing the parliament entirely. So, which is because democracy has been practiced. But in a democracy, how you reform is almost as important as what you reform, from all the story that we've been seeing and we're going to see also in the future. I'll also hand to Joseph to discuss more on the comparative policy and global norms in this.
Yeah, the
Go ahead,
first thing to
Joseph, please.
establish, yeah, sure. So one of the first things that we need to establish is that no major economy operates a free agricultural market. The debate is never whether to intervene, it's always about how. The United States spends roughly 20 billion US dollars a year through the Farm Bill, crop insurance, counter-cyclical payments, and conservation programs. When you look at the table, the EU's common agricultural policy runs a 55 billion euros annually in direct payments, now gradually decoupled from production. China also spends an estimated $212 billion for price support, inputs, subsidies, a guaranteed grain purchase system that mirrors India's minimum support price almost exactly. India spends about $25 billion annual spend supporting 15 to 18% of agricultural GDP. It's not an outlier. It's actually conservative by international comparison. The table tells us a clear story. Every major agricultural economy intervenes. What differs is the mechanism and critically the sequencing of the liberalization. The EU moved from production-linked subsidies to decoupled payments over decades with massive institutional investment first. The US built its countercyclical safety nets before exposing farmers to any market risk. Neither of these dismantled existing support structures overnight. That context really matters enormously for evaluating what Modi attempted. The direction was right, the pace and sequencing were not. I will hand over to Achievement to take us through the stakeholder decision matrix.
Thank you, Joseph. So every reform creates winners and losers, and understanding these stakeholders is important to this conversation. The small-scale holder farmers were one of the important stakeholders, and their main concern was income stability and debt relief. Their incentive was to preserve the MSP flow, and they had a fear that the corporate monopsony was replacing the APMC that they were used to. So it was a situation of trading one exploiter for another. So their fears were rational. On the other hand, the Modi government wanted market efficiency, FCI cost reduction, and investment and foreign investment in agriculture. But it faced also an electoral pressure problem from the agrarian states, and the UP and the Punjab states had been critical in the 2022 election. So the political cost was also high for the government. The consumers, both urban and rural, stood to gain the most from a competitive market, and lower food prices were beneficial, but they were unorganized and invisible in the political calculus. The agricultural business wanted supply chain access and contract farming at a larger scale, but the reputational and regulatory risks of being seen as villains also made them cautious. On efficiency versus equity, the core tension was market liberalization would improve aggregate efficiency, but the gains and the losses are not distributed equally. So removing the APMC restrictions reduced the debt loss. Private investment in cold chains and logistics would improve in the long term. These were real gains, but the efficiency gains accrue to consumers and agricultural businesses. The transitional costs would fall on the farmers and India's rural poor. So what remained, as Douglas North reminded us, markets are not natural. They require the correct legal infrastructure, contract enforcement, as well as the right information systems that may take decades to construct. So to liberalize, you had to build the institutions first before bringing in the law. I'll hand over to Savannah to give us a conclusion.
Can you guys hear Savannah? Savannah is muted.
Sorry, guys. I'll bring us home. We've looked at the economics, the politics, and the history. So, were the farmers justified? The answer is yes, but only partly. They were justified because losing a guaranteed minimum price is generally scary. Behavioral economics tells us that people hate losing what they already have far more than they enjoy the possibility of gaining something better. So asking millions of farmers to give up the certainty in exchange for trust us, the market will sort it out was optimistic. And that's just to put it politely, right? The problem was that the government never replaced that certainty with a legally binding guarantee. So no statutory MSP, no meaningful safety net, and which was just fake, right? And history wasn't exactly reassuring either. Similar liberalization efforts across sub-Saharan Africa left many farmers worse off. So it's understandable that Indian farmers thought, we've seen this movie before. But, and this is the important part, The protests didn't represent every farmer in India. They were driven mainly by wheat and rice farmers in Punjab and Haryana, who benefited most from the existing system. Meanwhile, millions of smaller farmers they weren't the whole story. And we look at the reform packages that we have here. So what should have happened instead? The issue wasn't the reforms themselves, it was the order they happened in. First, legislate MSP as legal right, remove the uncertainty and give farmers confidence that there's a genuine safety net. Secondly, improve the mandis before trying to replace them. Digitize price discovery, reduce commission fees, and maybe introduce competition gradually. Renovate the house before breaking the walls down. And then lastly, over the next few years, invest in the infrastructure first: cold storage, rural roads, and digital marketplaces. Markets that can't be competitive if farmers literally can't reach them. At the same time, strengthen contract farming laws with proper dispute resolutions and extra protections for smallholder farmers. Finally, in the long term, encourage crop diversification by expanding effective support. We've already discussed that they weren't looking beyond the wheat and rice. But in this case, they can look into pulses, oilseeds, and horticulture while rewarding more sustainable farming practices. So, in short, the reforms weren't necessarily wrong, they were just in the wrong order. So, to conclude, let's answer the three questions that we started with. Was the government intervention justified? Absolutely. Agriculture has multiple market failures, and every major economy intervenes in one way or another. Secondly, were the Modi reforms well designed? Partially. They correctly identified the problems, but they underestimated the importance of sequencing and trust. You can't build a bridge while asking people to cross it. And then lastly, were the farmers right to resist? Again, we can say partially. Their concerns were rational and valid, but the movement largely defended those who already had the strongest protections rather than those who needed them the most. And the biggest lesson isn't just about India. It's that good economics alone doesn't make good policy. Successful reform only needs trust, consultation, and institutions people actually believe in. So India tried to sprint before it learned how to walk. And that's why the reforms ultimately became one of the country's most significant policy reversals. Thank you so much.
Namaste.